Flashman. Go to the red tube.
Is that a push-up technically?
Yep.
Ex-Pogo stunt team. I'm emceeing the halftime show for the Creighton University game here in Omaha. Then we're driving down to Stillwater, Oklahoma. It's gonna be the Russ Kaus in the house solo Pogo show, bro. That's what we're doing. That's where we're at.
Make some noise for the Ex-Pogo stunt team.
This is gonna be the part of the show where I can go to the hospital. Now's the time. Let's hear it. Dangerous! 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 One backflip, two backflips, three backflips in a row. Ladies and gentlemen.
Halftime in Omaha went great. Then we dropped off our sick athlete at the airport, and about 20 seconds later, a little further down the terminal, the replacement athlete had landed, so that went off seamlessly. Drove down here to Stillwater. It was about a 6-hour drive. Very cold through the night, very tiring, but OSU halftime went well. Then we had a rest day yesterday. Now we have one more halftime at Oklahoma State University tonight, and then I get to go home and hang out with my girlfriend and dog and cat. There are two things kind of front of mind for me that normally haven't been recently, that are informing the way that I'm thinking about Bernie. The first is that I don't have cable TV at home, but in a hotel room I do, so I've been indulging myself and falling asleep to, CNN, MSNBC. Come back to that in a second. The second thing front of mind for me is that I went to the Goodwill a couple days ago, and I wanted to pick up a book, and I didn't want to think too hard about it. I just walked up to the bookshelf and was like, okay, the first thing that looks remotely interesting, I'm just gonna pick it up so I can get back in the motion, just try to start reading again. So the first thing that jumped out at me is a book from 2007 called The Brain That Changes Itself. I've only read chapter 1, so I don't know quite where they're going. What I've gotten so far is that until way recently, doctors, scientists viewed the brain as being very rigid. Like it had specific areas dedicated to specific tasks, and if one of those areas was damaged and you lost like some motor function or the ability to see, like you're just SOL. You're never gonna see again, sorry. Cars don't spontaneously generate new tires, and your brain doesn't spontaneously regenerate whatever part you need to like process visual input. But as it turns out, that's not as true as people thought. In fact, it's not true at all. They tell a story in the first chapter of a woman who was overprescribed a medication that damaged her inner ear function and basically just obliterated her sense of balance. She was left with this condition where she perpetually, no matter what she was doing, felt like she was falling and falling and falling into this infinite abyss. If anytime she tried to stand up, she would start wobbling, have to spread her legs way out, and just ultimately fall to the floor. It's obviously a very rare condition, but many people who suffer from it ultimately wind up killing themselves. But a doctor who dared to challenge the status quo of the understanding of how the brain worked decided to come up with a helmet with some accelerometers inside of it, and then attach that. I might be getting the specifics wrong here a little bit, but I think it was some sort of like an electrified plate that would be placed on the tongue, and it would just send little tiny electrical impulses depending on if you were like angled to the right or to the left or back, like basically replacing what your inner ear does with little pinpricky feelings on your tongue. It worked, and it worked immediately. As soon as she put the helmet on, her brain was plastic enough, was malleable enough to replace what the inner ear would normally do with this sort of pinpricky feeling on her tongue, and she could live a normal life in the helmet. But it gets better. She would take off the helmet, and then a residual effect would last for, some percentage of the time that she had worn it. If she wore the helmet for an hour, she might be able to exist normally for 20 minutes after she took the helmet off. She did this for, over a year, and ultimately she wound up not even needing, she's cured. She doesn't need to wear the helmet and now lives a normal life. Interesting book so far. I'm gonna keep reading it. All of that is to say that groupthink leading to a fundamental misunderstanding of what is possible is on my mind. How could that be relevant? I don't know. As for MSNBC and CNN cable news, it's like they think that primary voters are some clean slate every election cycle, carefully taking notes about the mainstream media's pre-approved centrist crop of candidates, figuring out, okay, you align with my policy views, and you align with my policy views. Oh, you don't right there. Okay, let's see. Okay, I'm for Beto. If the 2016 field had 10 or more candidates, even if Hillary Clinton had still emerged victorious, I think then she probably would have gone all the way versus Trump, because that's kind of like your conditioning. That's practicing the fundamentals of campaigning. Like if you went through a good faith process where you at least engaged with the left wouldn't have felt so alienated and wouldn't have been so vulnerable to Russian propaganda convincing the dumber members of the left to vote for like Jill Stein. But MSNBC and CNN tried to they're divorcing 2020 from that whole dynamic. Let's just sweep that under the rug. We all feel on some level that clearing the field was a mistake, and Bernie was the only one who didn't just go with the flow and clear himself out of the field too. That decision has aged very, very well. Let's not talk about it. It is also relevant that Bernie Sanders has 2.1 million small dollar donors. In second place of the announced candidates is Elizabeth Warren with 343,000. That is between 1/5 and 1/6 of what Bernie has. If we want to support a candidate that can just sprint right into the general election, Bernie Sanders is in a good position to do that. He doesn't need to dilly-dally in these first months of the campaign trying to build his base. He has his base. There are also a litany of critiques that you hear all the time about Bernie. It's like, is he a victim of his own success? You know, all of these candidates have now adopted basically his 2016 platform. So will the left have a whole smorgasbord of candidates to choose from? I think it will be relevant to primary voters that Sanders has been saying these things for his entire career, and it's not like, you know, kind of A, B, D, and F. It's like all of the above for Bernie. He speaks unequivocally truth to power. Cable news pundits like to, pontificate. Can Bernie really win in a general election, or is he too far to the left? I don't think, especially the general electorate, is nearly as hard and fast glued to specific policy ideas, so much as they just want to feel like they trust that the person speaking to them is being honest. I think that a waffly centrist is way more vulnerable in a general election than someone who clearly is speaking from the heart, has been consistent their entire career. And of course, there's the classic, he's too old. The day that Sanders announced, he did a half-hour interview with CBS, and he is sharp as a tack. I'll take those 30 minutes of Bernie Sanders and put it next to 30 seconds of Donald Trump any old day. Millennials, as much as we might hate that term, we are the largest generation in US history, and for the first time, we're all old enough to vote. This is our moment, and Bernie Sanders, I believe, is maybe better positioned to be our champion than anyone else. We don't need a fellow millennial in the presidential field. What we need is someone who kind of has this implicit, this psychological moral authority over our parents' generation. We're kind of angry at baby boomers for the planet that we're inheriting from them, and Bernie Sanders is a better person to kind of tell it to them like it is than us. He is our champion there. He's gonna kind of communicate to them how upset we really are, because it's a little hard for us to always be direct with our parents because we love them. My other kind of unique take on Bernie's age, maybe this is cynical, and I don't mean to be macabre, but if you look at US history, there is reason, a valid reason, to be concerned about any leftist leader and their safety. Heaven forbid, should something happen to the standard bearer of the leftist cause, as has happened many times in US history, better for it to be Bernie than AOC right now. When Bobby Kennedy was killed in 1968, there was no plan B. There was no one to step into that role, and it did doom the Democrats' chances in that presidential election. If history were to repeat itself during the 2020 process, if Bernie is the leftist standard bearer, I don't think it would play out the same way. I think that, the movement would be obviously devastated, but then would double the fuck down and have someone else step in there and continue to ride an even bigger, badder wave. And the last very common critique of Bernie Sanders' candidacy that I saw on cable was about reports of misogyny within the Sanders campaign from last time. Only time will tell if the Sanders campaign has successfully built in safeguards to prevent this sort of mismanagement, misbehavior from happening. I did find Sanders' response to this question in that CBS interview to be very compelling. He's, I think, genuinely heartbroken that this happened, under an organization that he's, in charge of. He says that they're going to have stronger safeguards than any campaign in history, and I take him at his word on that, but at the same time, it's up to all of us to continue to hold their feet to the fire and make sure they're following through. The brain is a more complex organism than scientists gave credit for. I think the electorate is a more complex organism than the pundits on cable news give credit for. The largest generation in American history, people my age, the millennials, have built new pathways for information that can totally subvert pathways that the old guard might take for granted. Anyone who's following the horse race of 2020 on mainstream media, I think, is in for a surprise about just exactly where in the field Bernie Sanders stands. I think he's the front runner, and I'm not convinced it's that close, although we'll see how this thing develops. This is all a gut feeling based on how misrepresented I felt in the mainstream media conversation. Maybe I'm the outlier. Like, maybe I'm just not fundamentally understanding where the average American is at. But it's just, I felt so misrepresented by the mainstream media that it tells me that I think that they misjudge where true north is. When we get like a few decades down the road from now and we look at the Trump era in hindsight, I sure hope, and I'm starting to think maybe we will, say that Trump was a catalyst for a growth spurt where a whole generation of Americans grew into this technological infrastructure that had been built out in the decade before, but that we never really felt the need to leverage to its full potential. And I think it could be very powerful. This is the 6th time they've practiced it. I guess they're doing the national anthem for the game. It is a good song. I don't know if it's good enough to listen to 6 times in a row, but they're doing a good job.